I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast my good friend, Jess. Now, Jess lost her dad when you were 11, didn't you, Jess?
That's right.
And when Ben died, Jess was a relatively new friend, more of an acquaintance, really. And she came to me once, we were probably both a little inebriated at a party, and explained this to me and said that she understood particularly what my eldest was going through. And I've always remembered this and held on to this very special kind of memory of somebody that I guess just reassured me that he was going to be okay, because I could see that you have a loving husband and family, and yes, you still have some grief. Of course you do. We're going to talk about that today, but primarily you are living a good life, aren't you? It hasn't destroyed your life.
No, definitely not. I think I having listened to a lot of your podcasts, I can hear the fear parents have got about trying to navigate this with children, which is why I came to you. I mean, this was even before the podcast, but I just came to you to say, yes, it's life-changing, but it doesn't have to be life-defining in a bad way, I think, because that's the fear, isn't it?
Yeah, and not life-ruining, I think, because as I've touched upon and spoke to Julia Samuel, I am dropping that name in there, about last week, you at the time you think this is the worst thing that happens. It's why it's used in children's books and children's films, every bloody Disney film. And then it happens to your child and you just think, how on earth do I shield them from this? And in many families' cases, particularly when we were children, the instinct was just to not talk about them. And then some parents would excuse me, sort of, and we've talked about this, the kind of forced grief, when, we're grieving, we're like, but why aren't you? So I really want to hear a child's perspective of this. I know you are a grown adult, but if you wouldn't, and also just, things that helped you, things that really didn't help you. I'm just really interested in having somebody else's perspective on it, on this podcast.
Yeah. So it's odd to look back at a time, because I remember it with a child's perspective. Of course, now I'm an adult, so it's odd to look back at those very childish memories of it, because funnily enough, they're still very clear. I remember it quite vividly because it was such an important point in my life. I was just about to go to secondary school when my dad was diagnosed with cancer. I started new secondary school not really knowing anybody, and then he died just before my first half term. So I'm 11, brutal, trying to make new friends. And by the way, hi, my name's Jess. My dad's dying in the background. It was traumatic. It was very traumatic. And it was in the mid-90s where there was no grief counselling. There were no charities, or there probably were, but we didn't know how to access them or where to go about it. My mum was actually divorced from my dad. She still took it really hard. She still loved him, and she really struggled for a long time. And so she didn't know what to do with me. I didn't know what to do with me. And it was really tough. It was a tough time in my life. And I know we've spoken about this before. When your sons joined our school, I actually sat down and spoke to my son and said, look, he might say some odd things. He might do some odd things. One moment he might be fine. The next moment he really might not be. And you just kind of have to go with that. And we've spoken since that actually we wonder whether that's why they've been such good friends. Because I think mine rolls with the punches a little bit now with yours, doesn't he?
Yeah, they are. And actually they really are close friends. They moved primary schools and they're no longer at the same school at secondary. So it's one of those nice friendships that sort of transcends distance, I suppose. Not that we're a million miles away, of course. There's a couple of things I really found interesting in there that you said, and a couple of really key things that I just noted down while you were talking. And one of them is 11 and transitioning to a secondary school. Like, it has to be one of the most difficult and challenging times in a young person's life, really. And to do that under the cloud of your dad being terminally ill. And I have spoken to people whose children have done just that, and we know how impactful it is. And we live in a time where people are very much encouraged, even within school to a certain extent, to talk about mental health. And you said, not knowing about support groups. And there's many negatives about the internet and its impact on mental health, but at least you can use it to find out where things are and what's available and find a peer group. I don't know how I would have got through without Widowed and Young and my peer support from there. And even now at schools, I genuinely know people whose children have been bullied because their parent has died. And
yeah, I experience people attempting to do that to me. I mean,
good luck.
For me, I was in so much pain from my dad dying that actually anything else couldn't really touch me. Like, I didn't care what other people thought. It was just like, what, you want to try and make fun of me? I don't give a damn about it, quite frankly, because there was too much else going on. So in one way, it did make me resilient, I have to say. But yeah, it
Would it make
I mean, I've spoken to you about what were you going to say?
Sorry, I did my talking over trick, Jess. You're used to that at least. So did you find that it made you a little bit more kind of closed off and more reluctant to open up to friends and things? And I know sometimes children can kind of struggle to form friendships because how can anybody understand that loss? And also you're very aware of things that you love and care about can be snatched away from you. So it can cause sort of almost like the reverse of an attachment issue where they just don't want to make attachments.
Yeah, I kind of felt like I was experiencing life behind a window pane a lot of the time. Like I was like slightly removed from it. And it was interesting because a few years ago, one of my friends from secondary school actually reached out to me and she said, my mum's died. Oh my God, I didn't know what you were going through. I'm so sorry I didn't cope with it better. And my response was, you can't know. And like, you can't know. And she was, I mean, I met her when she was 14. What's a 14-year-old meant to do with that kind of information? So it was lovely that she reached out, but all I wanted to say to her was there was nothing to forgive. How would you know?
I've had similar conversations with friends who have subsequently either lost their own partner tragically, or they have had other, horrible, nasty, terrible things happen. They will sometimes get in touch with me and say, I'm really sorry, I didn't do enough. And much like you, I say, how could you know? I was the same. I've apologized to friends who've had terrible tragedies and said, I did the wrong things, or I didn't know enough. And thankfully they are, kind enough to say, sorry, I'm rambling. They also would say the same. Until you experience something like this, you genuinely don't understand the impact and how it ricochets and seeps into every single aspect of your life. And to try and I can't say it. Say it, Jess. You say it. Go on.
I can't say it now. You've said it wrong too many times.
Compartmentalize aspects of your life. It's very challenging as an adult, as we know, and I myself am guilty of locking things away and not really processing, unbelievably, I know from listening to this. But I know for a child, on the cusp of sort of teenage years, when you're dealing with all the hormones, and it wouldn't surprise me if the sort of, in all of this, it's very hard to make meaningful connections at this age when everybody's forming their friendship groups. And I may be completely making this up, and this may not even be something that happened, but I'm just wondering if it was.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely had a few years where I struggled. I was friendly and I had a friendship group, but I found it hard. I mean, funnily enough, I had my first boyfriend at 14, and actually he was great. We dated up until I was about 18, 19. And
oh, wow.
Always great. He was a teenage boy, but he listened a lot and he took on a lot of what I was going through, and he did the best he could as well. And then again, I think mostly what he did was just listen when I needed it, and that really helped.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? It's wanting to be heard, because at this period in young people's lives, they are by nature very self-absorbed, because that's just it's in who we are at that age. And so for them to kind of have to think outside of their kind of safe world, I guess. And also people, like I said earlier, it is at that age the worst thing you can imagine happening, and they've just seen a friend of theirs go through it. It brings it into their reality. And I know very much from talking to friends of mine, who haven't been widowed, and I include you in this, sometimes I will post something or say something and you guys will message me and be like, God, I held my husband closer last night, because it brings it into your world and your reality, and it's no longer an abstract concept.
I mean, we obviously, your podcast is about widowhood, but grief is universal, isn't it? I mean, I've listened to almost all of your episodes and I've sobbed along with them because I know what they're feeling. And I was speaking to my mum about coming on here, and she talked about telling me, and apparently I made that inhumane noise when she told me too. And I've heard
Wow.
so many of your guests say that at the same
Yeah.
time, and that resonated with me. And the idea that you were talking about on Monday about, somebody saying something well-meaning to Monty and him really latching onto that. I had a very similar experience. Something that actually, it was even before my dad was sick. Have you ever read Anne of Green Gables?
Yes, many, many years ago. Don't ask me to quote it, please.
No,
What,
so I had the tape, cassette tape of it, of the story book.
This is how old we are, people.
Yeah, exactly. And I was listening to it probably about a year before he was diagnosed. And we got to the part in it where Anne loses her adoptive father, Matthew. He dies. And as I said, my dad was fine at the time. There was nothing wrong. And I started sobbing to the point where my mum, who was downstairs, heard and came up and saw me. And I was sobbing. And I said, I don't want my daddy to die. And she said to me, Daddy's not going anywhere for a long, long time, honey. And then the next year he was diagnosed with cancer. And in my child brain, I interpreted that as, holy shit, I can then tell when people are going to die. Or when people are going to be sick. So now every time I have a worrying thought about someone, I think, is it going to come true? Is it going to happen? And I realized that was the two things were entirely not connected. But in my child brain, I put the two together because why would you not? I was told my dad was not going to die for a long time, and he did. And I found that very, very difficult to deal with for quite a long time.
It shatters your reality, and that sounds like a sort of really extreme statement, but it does. Your entire reality and trust in the world is shattered. And I know I saw that in my children. I can feel myself go, because anything to do with the kids sets me off. But and I can see it now. I can see it now in them. And I've spoken previously on the podcast, that I'm going to be working with one of my children for next year to try and help him through this, because he's not yet been able to access the counselling and things that I do think are so valuable. And I'm guessing that sort of stuff wasn't available to you as an 11-year-old child going through this. And so just as a sort of side note, really, the fact that your parents went together, that must have impacted on how your mother grieved and therefore how you grieved. And how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so my dad, first of all, I want to say he loved me very much, and I absolutely know that. But he wasn't a saint. He struggled with alcohol. He would get violent when he was drunk. And so my mum left for our safety. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't love me, and I know he did. He just struggled. And so mum left not because she didn't love him, but because she needed to. But it was very hard for her, and it was very hard for who would become my stepfather, because he was in this relationship with a woman who's, in his eyes, whose ex had died, and she struggled very much. And I mean, my dad died in the October, and they actually married in the December, which was difficult for me. I mean, she was absolutely within her right to do it. She did nothing wrong with that, but it felt like
grieving. It felt a bit rushed, maybe.
It felt like there was a hurry to replace my dad, and I'm sure that's not what the intention was. But it felt a bit like it was like, whoa, my dad's dead, and then 2 months later, I have a new dad. That was it's a lot.
Little children often do say that as well. They, you get asked, multiple people have been asked, can we go to the daddy shop? Can we get a new daddy? When are we getting a new daddy? And Tabby said to me one night about one of her friends who's mother's part of my widow group, and she just said, do you think we can get her a new daddy too? And I just think, it's and I suppose in an 11-year-old, you're transitioning from child into adolescence, and you're so confused. This idea that your dad would just, in your eyes, be replaced, which of course your mother wasn't doing. Well, you don't know what your mother was thinking. I'm not your mum, but she may have just been sort of grabbing at happiness and thinking, right, I'm going to cement in this relationship, this is going to make me happy. But an 11-year-old is not going to understand that. And Monty, my oldest, has spoken to me about, feelings of, would I have time for him if I had a relationship, and would I love this person more? But of course, we are much more able to talk to our children about these feelings now. And we have a language that we didn't have with our parents, not because they didn't want to, but because you didn't have it. You didn't sit, people didn't say, oh, that knot in your stomach, that could be anxiety. Let's talk about what that might, and all these sorts of things. So it must have left you very, very isolated, I guess, because without access to all of this information and counselling and support, grief is very lonely, and being an 11-year-old is very lonely at times too. So I'm feeling quite a lot of sympathy for 11-year-old Jess right now.
I used to come home from school, and if I'd have a bad day, I'd find the cat, go upstairs and cry into the cat's tummy because no one could hear me then.
Oh, my poor dog suffered a few of those crying episodes, I have to say. She sort of senses now if I'm upset and comes and seeks me out. It's very sweet.
I found it really interesting. I mean, obviously, Julia should know what she's talking about, but I found it really interesting. The thing that comes back often is be clear and be blunt, I suppose is the word, because I remember, I'd been told that my dad was dying. It was still a massive shock at the time. I probably could have been told with being told repeatedly that he was dying. I mean, people sit down and have these very momentous conversations with their children and then think, oh, okay, I've done that. But actually, reinforcing it occasionally is probably a good thing too.
One thing that you mentioned early on in this conversation, Jess, and I wrote it down, and it was that you still remembered that time in your life, which was, dare I ask, how many years ago? About 13 years ago?
Yeah, nearly at 30 years.
Yeah, so nearly 30 years ago. And you remember that so clearly, because I asked Monty fairly recently, who is now 13, whether he remembered the time I told him. Because to be honest with you, I vaguely remember it, but it's pretty hazy, which surprises me. I would have thought I would have crystal clear recall of that night. But I mean, I remember it because I've repeated it so often. But to be honest, the details are hazy. But sorry. And anyway, he just looked at me and he went, of course I do. You don't forget that sort of stuff. And I thought, oh, wow, okay, because I've never asked him. And obviously we have talked in depth about Ben's death because of the added complication of him being missing. And also because I was able to access the literature that's out there that tells me that I should do this. But and then I think our parents' generation were raised by a generation that just would never have mentioned it again. And I have spoken to people whose parents have died and they just were never mentioned again. All evidence was removed. I mean, how traumatic, but they must have felt they were doing the right thing to some degree. Language. I mean, the other thing is the very clear language. Where do you stand on that? Because obviously you must have been told at some point.
Yeah, no, it needs to be blunt. It needs to be so that they understand. I mean, I remember the entire day that my dad died. I can remember, I mean, even before I knew, I didn't find out until the early evening. I can remember the entire day. And I can remember my mum picked me and my brother up from school. She took us to a nearby town that had a little park in the on the beach that had trampolines, and we went trampolining. And it transpired afterwards that she'd done that with the last of my dad's money. She'd given us this kind of lovely association with it. But then she took us home, and I went upstairs, and she called me down to the kitchen, and she sat me on her lap, and she said, "I've got something to tell you. Daddy's died, honey." And said, I made the same inhumane noise. And she talked to me for a bit, and then I went upstairs. And I remember going about my evening routine on autopilot, and still talking and still interacting, but just not really being there. I mean, I was in shock, complete shock. And I think that the idea you talk about, children listening and then playing. Yes, that I did exactly the same thing. I carried on with life, but the shock was definitely there, and I could definitely feel it.
And you did the 11-year-old equivalent. You went up to your room, which is
exactly
more appropriate than putting on your Harry Potter clothes, unless that's your bag, Jess. I don't know.
And I remember being consulted as to whether I wanted to go to the funeral, which I did. I remember being consulted whether I wanted to go and see Dad, which I did.
Oh, you did? Goodness me.
I was given free rein to choose, which for me, I'm really glad my mum did. I'm sure that's a decision that every parent has to make about their own child. But for me, that's something I really wanted to do, and I'm glad I did it. I found it I found that really traumatizing, not seeing him, but nobody had explained to me he was going to be cold. And when I touched him, it really scared me because
That's interesting.
he didn't feel like Dad. He felt something else, and that was really traumatizing. And I wish somebody had explained that, but then you don't know to explain it. You don't know that that's something that I hadn't thought about at the time.
No,
You know,
and in the midst of all of this, it wouldn't be. Yeah, you can see why they wouldn't. And actually, we talk about the sort of growing up in the 90s and not having, the same access and autonomy and conversations. But from the sounds of it, your mum actually really, really included you here because she's, I know people who have taken them to funerals. I know people who haven't. And it's, like you say, it is very, very personal and often related to the circumstances of the death, because I sometimes think, particularly the sudden death, people need the closure on it. I don't know, horrible word, but and then to offer you the opportunity to go and see him, which in itself is quite. I have never done it, and I've seen it on the telly. So you to be brave enough at 11 to do that as well, because presumably you had some idea of what was coming, but a really interesting point to be that detailed when you're talking to a child. If you want to go and see this person, they are dead and they will be cold and they won't look like them, and be really, really specific. And I don't know whether I'd have thought I haven't had to.
I mean, Dad did look like him. We dressed him in jeans and a shirt and boots. He wasn't in a formal suit. He did look like he was sleeping, and it wasn't. The stillness didn't disturb me at all. It was just how cold he was, which obviously now as an adult, I know. Of course, you have to refrigerate bodies, I think even as an 11-year-old, I knew it, but I hadn't put the dots together in my head.
Yeah, and it perhaps sort of the thought of reality in what was happening. That it looked like Dad, but it wasn't, and maybe kind of that real jolt of this is actually real, rather than something that the adults have told me.
And I found,
and children, they are.
And I think we've talked at length about, sometimes your children just don't want to talk about it. I found it very difficult to let anyone see my grief for a long, long time. I still struggle, actually. Every year on my dad's birthday, the whole family will raise a glass together, and we will say, and my children are very aware of their granddad Peter. My eldest is even named after him, and we talk about what happened, because death is a part of life, and children are going to experience it. And I think the more you can talk about it without being morbid, the more it can be casual, then actually the less scary it becomes. And of course, it's growing up in the 80s or 90s, I'd lost a grandparent who I didn't know. And I remember going up to Yorkshire for the funeral. I didn't go to the funeral because I was little. This was my first experience of death. And I mean, funnily enough, we took our children up to see the Queen. We stood in line for the Queen because
I didn't know this, Jess.
We did. Well, I felt like the Queen was somebody that the children knew about and had seen on telly a lot. And so we went up and paid our respects, and we talked about how the Queen had died, because I thought, if you can introduce the idea of death gently when it's not so emotive, surely that's got to help in the future. I don't know. I'm making up as I go along too. But
no, I think you're absolutely right. No, I absolutely think you're right. And I feel very sad that my children learned about death so young in such a catastrophic way, and that you did as well, because children shouldn't learn about it. It should be a pet, and the horrible death of a grandparent, which is awful. But of course, my children now have got a really close relationship with my parents, but let's not even dwell on that one.
I invited my children to all of my grandparents' funerals. So my grandparents have died in the last 5 years, and the children came to theirs because, again, they saw grief, they saw mourning, but they were just a little bit removed from it. And I thought that's a nice way to ease into death, maybe.
Of this idea that death is part of life. I mean, this is one of the things we're doing here. We're kind of shining light on this last taboo, and one of the things I did talk with Julie and Samuel about, and I have spoken about as well, is this feeling of powerlessness. And we feel very powerless as adults when this happens to us. And then for a child who doesn't have that much power or autonomy in the world anyway, they they then have all of these choices and decisions taken. And I'm really nice to hear that your mum did involve you like that.
I think that's why she did it. I think that's why she let me choose. I think
Yeah.
she could tell I was drowning and I needed some control over something.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
she absolutely listened to what I wanted to do. And I'm sure she worried in the background about whether it was the right thing or not. I'm sure she probably second guessed herself. But for me,
well, we do
I'm
all the time, right?
personally
One of the really difficult things about being widowed is the sense of isolation. It is a sense of being different. And even as an adult, it is horrible. You feel a little bit like you've been thrust into a new school and everybody's got this glow around you. So to actually have that happen, I can really sort of empathise to a certain degree. Now, as a child particularly, you are glaringly aware of any difference, aren't you? Children don't want to be different. And having a dead parent does make you different. So I think much of what we speak about here, about the sense of community and speaking about this stuff, I really want to see this happen for our children. And I do see it happening. There's lots and lots of grief charities that offer sort of support for young adults and children. And because I know myself that when I see my children mixing with other children who've lost a parent, it normalizes what they've been through, which is really bloody tragic that they have to. But it does. And much like it does for me, I want to be able to talk to other people that have lived this experience. And I also want to see people who have come through it. And one of the hugely empowering things of doing this podcast is speaking to people who have literally walked through hell and come out to tell the tale. I'm now seeing that in you. I'm seeing a child whose life was blown apart at such a pinnacle and fundamental age. And, you were left with, understandably lots and lots of questions, and there wasn't the support there is now. But to see that you are happy and safe and settled, and that, like you say, it was a life-changing moment, but not a life-defining or ruining one. And I think that is something that I, as a mother, have held on to desperately. And I know that so many parents listening to this will also feel the same, that with support, and it doesn't have to come in the costly counselling, it just comes in the form of talking and enabling them to talk and keeping the memories alive and all the things that we are trying to do, because actually that is where the value is, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it gives us a great radar. So if somebody wasn't worth my time, I didn't spend time with them for a long, if people weren't going to be kind and compassionate and be there for me, then I didn't want to know, really. I can be quite closed off if I want to be. And I certainly had that to a lot of my teenage years. But it meant that, when I found my husband, he was there for me and he would listen. And I talked to him about what I'd gone through and he listened. I mean, he has both of his parents. He's never lost anyone that close to him. And so he can't empathize, but he can listen and he can hear me. And it meant that I was able to build a very lovely life for myself. I have 3 wonderful children and I love them very much.
I can confirm this. They are lovely. They are.
And I mean, and things like, as I said, they know their granddad. They know that it hurt me a lot. They know they've asked the questions. Oh my God, the questions children ask. I've heard so many of your guests talk about it. I will never forget being on the way to school when my eldest was about 5, and he said, "Mummy, did you put Granddad in a box and set him on fire?" And my response was, technically, yes.
Well, I mean, we do talk about the importance of honesty and bluntness. I mean, probably clarifying that he wasn't alive at the time is beneficial before he went to school. But
yeah, but again, I could have. I mean, obviously, I talked about it in a bit more detail with him, but I could have skirted around that issue. But actually, yes, that is what we did. We put his body in a box and we set it on fire. And I mean, it's done with a bit more discretion than that, but that is technically what we did. Yeah. And it was important. I think it was important for him to hear that, yes, he was right. He'd got the right end of the stick. Not quite how it happened, but that was essentially right.
Yeah, and the importance of saying when we don't know as well, because
Yeah.
we all have questions we don't know. We don't know why them, and so many questions that I had was why me? Why us? Why my children? Why my family? And of
Yeah.
course, they would have had all the same questions. And sometimes you just have to say, I don't know. And I think there is a real power in acknowledging your own limitations where children are concerned. Because to try and be
No,
this all-knowing, almighty presence, this doesn't work, does it?
No, my mum is one of four, and I have a lot of cousins, and me and my brother, the only one out of our cousins still to lose a parent. Why me at 11? Why have they still got their dads? Now, I love my uncles very much. I'm very glad they're here, but I do remember thinking that a lot. Why me? Why was
Yeah.
it me? Why not one of them?
Yeah, and I wondered that with my kids because, particularly two of Ben's brothers look so much like him, and they're getting to watch their children grow up with their dad, and that must be quite unsettling. But I think, and actually, one thing I just wanted to quickly ask you while I've still got you, Jess, just touching on the subject of your brother, if I don't mind, because you
Yeah.
said to me once, and I found this really interesting. I think I did mention it in the interview with Julia, was this idea that you are able to remember your dad, and therefore you are able to remember and feel the pain of the bereavement. Your brother was younger and he doesn't remember the loss, does he? He's aware of the loss, but he doesn't remember him dying. And you, you tell it in your own words, but I was really interested in when you sort of mentioned your take on this, because obviously I've got one child that absolutely doesn't remember, and then I have two that do, and I have Holly who remembers her mum, and so it's just different ways of grieving for different kids.
So my brother was 5 when my dad died, and he came to the funeral too, but we brought a box of Lego, and he sat on the floor in the pew and built Lego for the funeral. He didn't realise.
Genius idea.
Yeah, and he has memories of dad where we have told the story so much he thinks he remembers them. He has what we call borrowed memories.
Yes.
And funny enough, Joe was always the one that I would talk to about dad. If Joe wanted to talk about dad, I never minded talking to him about it. I hated talking to anybody else, but he, I'm very protective of my little brother, who is of course now like 5, like a good 1.5 foot taller than me, but still my little brother. And
But
so
you were the keeper of the memories for him, weren't you? You were the keeper of the memories. If he didn't remember, you would have positioned yourself at that young age as the keeper of the memories and taken that responsibility to share them with him, which is a really lovely role, but a role that has a responsibility as well.
Well, of course, again in the 80s and 90s, we didn't take that many photos.
No.
I haven't heard my dad speak since I was 11 because we don't have any videos. We didn't have a video camera at the time. And so it's really difficult. And I've thought about it off and on over the years, which is best, to have the trauma and the memories, or to not have the trauma and no memories. And I would choose the trauma every time. I remember breathing a sigh of relief when each of my children reached 6, and I knew that if I was to die, they would remember me, because I wanted them to have memories of me. I have taken, my kids are possibly the most photographed kids on the planet. We have so many photos, we have so many videos with me in them too, because I just thought, if something were to happen, I'd like them to have the memories.
It makes everything different, doesn't it? You think about these things, you wouldn't necessarily have thought. I'm the same. I'm getting better at being in front of the camera, but how many times do we get our husbands to take a picture and we go, oh my God, I look disgusting, delete it. And I really think we need, I'm much better at going, just put it in a file that I don't have to see for a few years. And then I reckon in 10 years, I'll look back and go, oh, well, that's all right, actually. But you are so right. You become the keeper of the memories. And now I take on that role in the family. And I'm very aware that I want to create all these tangible memories. And you're right. It probably comes from in case something happens to me. And I have said previously, I haven't managed to watch videos of Ben. I've managed to listen to a voicemail. But hearing you say that makes me realize how actually crucial it is that I offer this to my kids, that I get, my dad is wonderful and he is the keeper of the video, see? So I'm going to ask him to pull together sort of some video montages for them, because hearing you say that, of course, I can remember his voice, but I spent a lot longer with him than they did. And I should not try and deny them that. So even if it's too uncomfortable for me, I will ask somebody else. So I'm really, hearing you say that has made me decide to do something to help my kids. So that's been really valuable for me personally.
I
And I
mean, my
think
aunt found a video recently. She had a video camera and she found a video, and it's a tiny clip of my dad in it, and he doesn't speak. But I come running into the room and I fling my arms around him. And he sent it to me, and I mean, I must have watched it so many times. And I showed the children, this is your granddad Peter. Look, you can see him, because a photograph is flat, it's frozen, but to see a video, it was really powerful. And I sent it on to my brother, who said, "Oh my God, look, look how young he looks. Look how much I look like him." And I think, photos are fantastic, but there is something about video which is just, yeah.
You are. I must do it. I think I will. Next time I see my parents, I will have this conversation, because I think it is time, and maybe it's time for me as well. Maybe I need to push myself to cross that kind of final barrier, because what's it going to do? What's it going to do? Make me sad? Too late, and I would like to. I think I struggled with the idea of seeing him vibrant and alive. But maybe I'm ready to cross that now.
Well, anyway, the thing is, the footage is there. It's not going anywhere. So
there is that,
it's. I mean, what I'm simply saying is, take the footage, have the footage there for when you need it. And I mean, I hate having photos taken myself too, but I do it, and I put them up so the kids can see, because again, one day we're not going to be here, and it is nice to leave something, isn't it?
And let's be honest, they think we're wonderful anyway, don't they? Apart from when they're commenting on our outfits, and I'm talking about the eldest, who told me a pink jumpsuit was not acceptable for the school run, which I thought was rude. Anyway, Jess, it has been a pleasure as always to talk to you. And actually, maybe we need to just schedule these in so we can have regular chats, because you can imagine what it's trying to. It's trying to be like meeting up when you've got 7 kids between you.
And I mean, if you have guests that ever want to ask my opinion, or I am no expert on anything other than having been through it, but if you have, because I can hear how worried a lot of your guests are, and it will be fine, they will get through it, but if you do have questions, I'm more than happy to give my perspective on anything.
You are so kind, Jess. That really is kind. And I, of course, am able to direct you to many children's support charities that can help you. So once again, thank you everybody for listening, and we will be back with you shortly. But for now, all of you take care of yourselves. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you think someone else may benefit from this, please do share. We'd also really appreciate a quick review. It helps more people find the show. Thank you again, and see you next time on Widowed AF.